So I'm genuinely confused by a side on government who say that in the status quo it's problematic that too many people feel that they have no incentive to aspire to go to university because they feel that it's more difficult, or that they feel it's not something for them, whilst then deciding to even further restrict access for people both on a symbolic level where they feel that they won't be able to afford it and they're not going to get this magical bank loan that will be given out to everyone because they can prove they've got some potential age 17. Or that they actually physically can't afford it, or even afford to go on and learn construction at a vocational college because of the fact it's a recession and companies aren't magically investing loads of money to allow people access to this, just as happened after the 2008 banking crash. We think that their whole side is predicated firstly on a warped reality where they want to restrict access to these areas of learning for people who've already had traditional access to it in their community backgrounds, as well as making it far harder for people to ever aspire to be better. We think that's damaging. They've been heavily reliant, ladies and gentlemen, on a load of assertions about where this money is going to come from and have never been able to properly substantiate it. I'm looking at three things. Firstly, in terms of funding, will the market solve, as they keep repeating? Secondly, what's best for poor people, something which was conceded in the last speech should be of paramount importance. And thirdly, what are the wider social ramifications, and why do we think they restrict society to those who are already privileged? No. So let's look at the first idea about funding. Because what we hear from them is that it's outrageous that taxpayers are funding these hobbies, these things that people do just because they enjoy them. And that actually people were serious about it and did care. They'd be able to get that money anyway. So apparently Oxford under the status quo is only accessible to rich people. Well, so I say, coming from a family that had never been to university and didn't really have a community around who have been into tertiary education, actually, my ability to get into Oxford was massively widened when it was that the state was, putting a guarantee down for me that I was going to be able to afford my years there without, having to get 3 jobs and prostituting myself. But what we recognise is that a lot of this comes from things like research grants. It's not all just taking it from the state. It's research grants from privileged institutions because of the amount of research that happens that allow you things like the Oxford Opportunity Bursary. Whereas the main amount of money that compels you to go there or allows you to have the ability to go is the knowledge that the state is going to writ out loans for you in the lead up to you going. I think that's important. But we don't think it's just about that, right? Because they say, well, where are people going to get the money from if they're poor? Well, banks will lend it to them. Because apparently, if someone's going to make a great banker later on, then obviously the banks will give out this money. We just don't think that's true, right? Firstly, because we think people will assume the banks won't, and the people who do are probably the ones who've got access to these sorts of elites and privileges that exist anyway. It's probably age 17, the person who's like, well, I'm going to be an amazing banker at the end of it, is someone who already knows he's going to get a job with one of daddy's friends at Goldman Sachs later on. Whereas, right, if I'm from an impoverished background and I know that I've been told that I've got skills and should be able to get some merit, I don't need to rely on knowing daddy's connections as to how I would write a bank loan or apply for one. I know that this is going to need to be there. So when I get there, no thank you, I get my degree, I can then go and do something as opposed to writing myself off at the very beginning. So that's something is a problem that exists now, but they make far worse when the state isn't underwriting that. And then we point out to them that it's problematic, right? Because tertiary education also is about vocational skills, it's about construction careers, it's about electricians. That's where the majority of taxpayers' money goes, because those are the ones that are on the ground where you need technical skills and you need the ability to operate, for example, machinery or access to the latest methods. That's something now that they are saying that people shouldn't do and shouldn't go to, right? People can't afford to get it. And we ask them where they're going to get the funding from. And they say, well, private companies will do it. With what money, right? Private companies aren't there to underwrite, no thank you, all of these different groups of people within society. They have profit incentives. And we think that ultimately what will happen is if you end up in, for example, a recession like I mentioned earlier in 2008, where apprenticeships just weren't available for people because companies couldn't afford it, how is that ever going to work in their life where they are reliant on an ever-expanding private market like no unions don't? So, let's look at this next idea about whether or not this is best for people. Because we essentially got from these guys that people the people that can get access to this, we're thinking in the status quo, are the people with money from the bank of mummy and daddy, right? Already people who come from privileged circumstances, who went to university, and therefore have got, as a result, inflated potential earning power. We think that's important. Because it means that there are communities who are impoverished, have an artificial and wrong cap on their aspirations and as well as on their earning power that they can use to make a real difference to both their futures, their families, and the earning potential of the communities from which they're from. Go.
Let's go back to the person with daddy's connections who's got lots of money. There are plenty of those people, and your model throws lots of money at them. What is the possible justification for that?
Because it does throw lots of money at them, but it allows money to go to lots of other people who, under your model, will never be able to access it in the first place. So even if some of it does maybe get wasted on these people, we think that ultimately it's better that lots of other people who would never have that sort of access are able to do it in the first place. And ultimately, if we are throwing money at these people and it does end up in them getting more money or being paid higher later on in life, they're taxpayers, so they're putting money back into the system. We're happy with more people being richer overall, if it means especially that we waste some money on people who might do it anyway, if we're able to get lots and lots of people who otherwise would never be able to get it because they've been systematically ignored or discriminated against by the state, which is all of the obligation stuff we give you and get no response to. So ultimately we think that's why it's the state that has the duty, and not flimsy construction services or private industries that you have no control over actually doing it in a viable and long-term way. We think that when banks are collapsing or have collapsed, or when construction services and private industries have collapsed, we can never be reliant upon them for the poorest and most vulnerable in society to have access to the sort of education that can help those communities. So let's look at this next idea about the wider social ramifications of it. So he said that, well, these are pointless degrees, and what it does is just pushing people, a child, into doing pointless subjects like philosophy and not mechanics, despite them being good at that. I just think that's nonsense. I just do not think there's this, at least the schools that I've worked in these deprived areas, whose parents are like, oh, you should go and do that philosophy degree, and that's something you should definitely choose to do over being a builder. Just not true, right? But even if it does, we don't care because there's wider access to lots of other people. So we think it's important with that. We think it's important that if you do get these people in who otherwise wouldn't have that sort of access, especially because we think it's a very good mixing pot at universities to see lots of different spheres of cultures and aspects of society mixing along. And they say, well, you can meet them at the football. What? Like, I'm sorry, when I'm sitting in like my stand at Chelsea because I'm sort of a multi-millionaire banker, I'm probably not going to be mixing with the guy who goes to West Ham in East London, like with a pint and like freezing in like middle of East London. Like, that's just not going to happen. And they never showed why it was comparable. Yeah, ultimately you get lots of different benefits, which means you're able to interact with other people, have a bigger impact on the communities from which you came, which they want to shut out of education and potential earning curve forever. That's why we're so happy to propose.
Alright, what we're going to do for a short period of time, the bus is coming soon, for 2 or 3 minutes what I want everyone to do is sit back, go back over their notes, try to come up with a decision, okay? Because the important part of learning to debate is also learning to adjudicate and make an assessment of debates, okay? So, no. Well, yeah, we can take a vote or something, that's fine. But I want you to look back through your notes, try to construct a decision, if you can, and think about maybe 2 or 3 things you want to give in terms of feedback, okay? About the debate as a whole, about one team, about a speaker, it doesn't matter to us. But everybody should be constructing some feedback.